Now that it's 2021 and there are a whole slew of new GPUs from both Team Red and Team Green out, and a lot of people are thinking about upgrading from their older 1060s and 1070s, for example, I thought now would be a good time to test out those older cards against a more new age counterpart like this 3060 Ti. The thing is though, is it worth sticking with those older cards, at least for now, especially with stock shortages, or is the performance delta worth that upgrade and the price hike? Also, should you be upgrading your CPU first? Let's answer all of those questions in this video. And of course, first, if you haven't already, consider subscribing for more videos like this one every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So you're still rocking a GTX 1060 or 1070, but maybe you're considering an upgrade. Honestly, I get it. The 1060 and 1070 were great cards for the time. They offered pretty reasonable value for money, especially at 1080p, and gave a pretty decent gaming experience. But with all of the new cards like the 3060 Ti coming out, they offer what seem like astronomical amounts more performance, and especially considering the used GPU market pricing right now, your old card might actually sell for a decent amount of money, enough that you could pick up one of these newer cards for not too much of a step up. Now, to be able to see a good reference for how much faster the 3060 Ti is over these older cards, I'm using a Ryzen 5900X as my modern reference CPU. But the thing is though, most of you who are rocking these older cards aren't using a brand new Ryzen 5000 series CPU. You're using, first gen Ryzen or some of the older Intel chips, and so I thought I would test with a Ryzen 1600X as well, as that was a pretty decent pair for these sorts of cards, and will give a reasonable estimation of older CPU single-threaded performance, which, as we know, is generally more important in games. Finally, I also tested at both 1080p and 1440p, as especially with these newer cards, a lot of people are looking to move up to the 1440p experience, which honestly, from a personal standpoint, I love it. I've been gaming at 1440p for a couple of years now, and it's fantastic. But if you're using these older cards, you probably aren't quite ready for that yet, whereas with the newer ones, you definitely are. So, benchmarking at both. Either way, let's start by taking a look at some benchmark numbers, starting with COD Modern Warfare. Now, because COD is a relatively well-optimized game, at least in the grand scheme of things, and as you'll see, there are some real unoptimized ones coming soon, I was running all of my tests here at what are essentially ultra settings. There aren't presets here, but pretty much everything maxed except for tessellation because I've had some bugs with that, and DXR off as well because of course the older cards don't directly support ray tracing, and well, let's face it, I think that'd be a bit unfair, and also I personally wouldn't turn DXR on unless I was playing campaign, so that one stays off. Now, in terms of the performance numbers at 1080p, all of the cards hit over 60 FPS. The 1060, even at ultra settings, did manage over 60 FPS at both with the slower CPU and the faster new one, although the 1% low numbers weren't fantastic, especially with that slower 1600X. We're looking at like 42 FPS for a 1% low there, which wasn't a terrible playing experience, but was enough to give a slight jutter every now and again. When it comes to the 1070, that one was sitting at over 85 FPS with both CPUs and was a pretty decent playing experience with over 60 FPS in the 1% lows as well. If you were to drop those settings, you would be able to get a more higher refresh rate experience at 1080p, and of course, if you're running those sorts of cards, you probably would anyway, but reasonable performance nonetheless. With the 3060 Ti, it offers a sizable advantage. Even with the slower CPU, you're going from 87 FPS with a 1070 to 134 with the 3060 Ti, and if you're rocking a newer CPU, you can get 156 average, again at ultra settings, which is a lot better, and actually over double the 1060 and closing on double with the 1070 as well, so a decent performance advantage. CPU-wise, clearly the more GPU horsepower you have available, the more your CPU can be a bottleneck. If you have a 3090 with these two CPUs, you would see this even more clearly, but basically the lower down the stack, the less power your GPU has, there is less of a bottleneck from the CPU, less of a hindrance. And so with the newer GPUs, with the faster ones, you're going to see more of a performance loss, or essentially you're going to see a bigger gain by upgrading your CPU. But with the older ones, it's a lot less of a big deal. Moving on to the 1440p numbers, you can see that the CPU matters a lot less here. Even with the 3060 Ti, there was a very minimal drop. I think it's 11 FPS average, if you round the numbers, which isn't a massive deal. Of course, 11 FPS is still a reasonable amount to lose, but it's not as large a gap, especially in terms of percentage, compared to the 1080p numbers. With the 1070 and the 1060, they were pretty much all within margin of error, with the only difference being ever so slightly slower 1% lows with the slower CPUs. Otherwise, in terms of the raw performance between the cards, you're looking at the 3060 Ti offering almost 3 times the performance of a 1060 and 2 times the performance of a 1070, depending on what CPU you have. Now moving on to a horrifically unoptimized game, Cyberpunk 2077, this one was actually really surprising for me to see. Of course, this is an incredibly difficult game to run, no matter what graphics card you have, even at low settings, which is what I was benchmarking here, and with ray tracing turned off, but it also seems incredibly CPU limited. When looking at the 3060 Ti numbers, you can see that with the 12-core 5900X, we're getting a pretty decent 101, or technically 101.46 FPS. But when we switch over to the 1600X, well, that one is only getting 55, or round it up, 56 FPS, or almost exactly half. And that's a crazy amount of performance to lose. And the thing is that when you look at the lower part of the graph as well, the 1070 with the faster CPU almost matches the 3060 Ti with the 1600X instead. And then the 1060 actually beats the 1070 with the 1060 using the faster 1500X and the 1070 using the slower 1600, and then obviously the 1060 with the 1600 comes in at the bottom of the graph. This is an incredibly interesting thing for me to see. I didn't realize that Cyberpunk was quite this CPU limited, but also in terms of looking at the performance numbers itself, the only card that offers reasonable performance here with the slower CPU is the 3060 Ti. If you want to use the 1070, you're with the older CPU, you're looking at 38.76 FPS average at low settings. Like, you basically can't make this run any faster on these old cards. And if you want to run the 1060 on that older CPU, you're looking at 34. That's not a great playing experience, and especially considering that the 1% low numbers for the 1060 was 13 FPS and for the 1070 was just 16. Trust me when I say it wasn't a great playing experience. And moving on to 1440p, it's almost exactly as bad. The 3060 Ti does drop a slight bit of performance with the newer CPU, as you would expect. More pixels to render, less performance out, but it's still just shy of 90 FPS, which is a very playable experience even at 1440p. When it comes to using the slower CPU though, what was interesting here is that the 3060 Ti with the 1600X actually got pretty much the same performance both at 1080p and at 1440p. That goes to show you just how much of a CPU bottleneck there is, where that card cannot get more performance with that slower CPU. That's how much of a bottleneck there is, which is kind of crazy. With the 1070, you're looking at pretty reasonable for 1070 at 1440p in Cyberpunk, 41 FPS average, and with the 1070 with a slower CPU, you're looking at 37, and then you're looking at 30 FPS for the 1060 with the new chip and 29 for the old one. Realistically, if you want to play Cyberpunk, the 3060 Ti is pretty much the only compelling option unless you have a newer or higher end CPU, in which case the 1070 might just be okay. But again, bear in mind this is all on low settings. Moving on to Fortnite, at epic settings with DirectX 12 enabled, but things like ray tracing and NVIDIA Reflex turned off, we're seeing what you'd kind of expect in terms of the performance results here. Fortnite is a lot closer to an esports title, and so all of these GPUs at 1080p, even at epic settings, were able to give well over 60 FPS. The 3060 Ti runs away with it, as you'd kind of expect, with just shy of 200 FPS average with the faster 5900X CPU. With the slower 1600X CPU though, there is a massive performance delta. It goes from nearly 200 to around 140, and that is a massive gap. That's the difference between playing nicely on a 140Hz monitor and playing nicely on a 240Hz monitor. Of course, you can always turn the settings down, but for raw performance, you would see a pretty decent performance uplift from upgrading your CPU once you have one of these newer, faster graphics cards. With the 1070, you're looking at between 90 and 100 FPS depending on which CPU you have, which is a very good result. At 1080p, this is a reasonable amount of performance to play with a high refresh rate monitor and have a pretty good experience. You can always turn some settings down a bit if you want to make use of either proper high refresh rate monitors or the ultra high refresh rate monitors like 240Hz, but it's still a pretty decent experience and your CPU upgrade wouldn't matter all that much. And with a 1060, that does a pretty decent job too. You're looking at 75 FPS no matter which CPU you get, which is fine for that kind of card in this sort of game, especially epic settings. If you wanted to make use of a higher refresh rate 1080p monitor, turning your settings down would be a great way to achieve that, and I think that would be the same no matter which type of new or old CPU you have as well. At 1440p, the CPU is, as we would expect, a lot less of a bottleneck. The 3060 Ti only drops, I think, 6 FPS here, and while the 1070 technically only drops 2, the 1% low numbers do suffer a fair bit with the older CPU, although the 1060 is well within margin of error for both the 1% lows and for the average numbers. Moving on to Watch Dogs Legion, this was a game that, despite having and me using their canned benchmark, which in theory offers a lot better repeatability, this offered me the most amount of headaches when both collecting data and trying to work out what the hell any of it means. Seriously, I cannot explain some of the results here, as you will find out, but let's start with the 1080p numbers. This was on medium settings, which was the sweet spot between giving good enough performance on all of the cards while still having a reasonable amount of quality. Of course, you could turn that down to low for the slower cards to get a bit better performance, but we're sticking with medium for now. Now, with the 3060 Ti, as you'd expect, it has a pretty sizable advantage. With the newer CPU, with the 5900X, you're looking at 116 FPS average, although if you swap to the 1600X instead, well, you drop a sizable amount of performance. You're dropping 40 to 50% performance here with the same GPU, which indicates a pretty strong CPU bottleneck, and actually what confirms that is the fact that the GTX 1070 is actually faster than the 3060 Ti, where the 1070 is using the newer 12-core and the 3060 Ti is using the slower 6-core. That is a very strange result. It's something that I ran multiple times to confirm, but yes, indeed, if you have a faster CPU, it matters a lot more in Watch Dogs than it does in a lot of other games. As with most CPU bottlenecks, the 1060, the lowest power card here, really wasn't affected by it. They're pretty much within margin of error of each other. The only difference is 1 FPS in the 1% lows, which, like I said, within margin of error. And while the 1070 does suffer a little bit, it certainly doesn't suffer as much as the 3060 Ti. Even with the slower CPU, you're still getting 69 FPS average versus 76 FPS average with the faster CPU, so a slight difference, but not game-changing. And at 1440p, the results look more reasonable, except for the GTX 1070 ones. Now, starting with the 3060 Ti, this offers 95 FPS average at 1440p, and that's actually not a massive gap drop from the 1080p results, which is kind of surprising. But what's more surprising is that the performance numbers with the 1600X at 1440p almost exactly match the 1080p numbers. That goes to show you how much of a CPU bottleneck there is, where at 1080p it can perform so minimally thanks to the CPU that even at 1440p the GPU basically doesn't work any harder. Well, essentially the GPU does, but the CPU is clearly the limitation there. The GTX 1070 actually doesn't drop all that much performance, except for with the new CPU. I cannot explain this. I cannot fathom why this is the case. I reran the benchmarks with both CPUs like 10 times each, and yet the newer CPU is significantly slower than the older one. Like I said, I can't explain this. I'm going to leave that one to you. If you have any suggestions, feel free to leave that in the comments below. But yeah, let's move on to the 1060. Now that card, much like the 1080p numbers, isn't really affected by the CPU, and so only performs basically as well as it can, which is 41 FPS average and 1% lows of 32. That isn't quite playable. You would want to drop that to the low settings, but honestly you'd probably want to drop it to low even at 1080p anyway, as 60 FPS average is fine, but you want to have that a bit above 60 to have a very smooth and enjoyable experience with a 60Hz monitor. Now I don't know about you, but I actually learned a fair bit about the different games and just how surprisingly CPU limited both Watch Dogs and Cyberpunk were. I didn't know that, but I guess it kind of makes sense, especially with Cyberpunk, how detailed and open world it is, and I suppose to a degree so is Watch Dogs, and a lot of player calculations as well. But I should mention that with Cyberpunk, the test that I was running was in the downtown area, so rendering all of the different players, the cars, all that sort of stuff was a reasonable factor there, so keep that in mind. Either way, if you're looking at the performance numbers, the 1060 does a reasonable job at 1080p. At medium to low settings, you should be able to get a decent high refresh rate 1080p experience in most games, and if you want to run it more medium-high, then you get a good 1080p 60 experience. With the 1070, it has a bit more grunt that you can use for that high refresh rate experience and with slightly higher settings, or you can drop them down and have closer to, especially for esports titles, that ultra high refresh rate experience. But comparing to the 3060 Ti, there is a massive performance gap in sensible games. You're looking at anywhere between 2 to 3 times more performance than the 1060 and 2 to 50% more performance than the 1070. If you have one of these cards, it would be a pretty reasonable upgrade to go with something like a 3060 Ti or even potentially the new 3060 or I guess 3070 if you can afford it. And so that would be a good upgrade. Of course, stock is definitely a limitation for you right now, but what about upgrading your CPU? Well, the thing is that with most CPU bottlenecks, the more graphics horsepower you have, the more your CPU will be a bottleneck. As we saw with the 1060, it was basically not bottlenecked at all in any of the titles within kind of reasonable assumption, whereas the 1070, which has a bit more power, did see the performance drop between the faster and slower CPUs. And of course, with the 3060 Ti, the performance gap in some games in Fortnite was 60 FPS at 1080p, and in some games was a bit closer, but it was definitely a lot more affected. So the answer here is that if you want to upgrade one part of your system, upgrade your GPU. It will give you the best performance advantage and will probably cost about the same as upgrading your CPU anyway, and so it gives you a good extra playable experience, especially with something like the 3060 Ti. If you then move to 1440p, which is definitely possible with those sorts of cards, your CPU is a lot less of a bottleneck. But especially if you're sticking at 1080p, or you just want that extra little bit of performance, upgrading your CPU after you have the faster card will offer you a reasonable performance bump down the line to get more out of your existing or your now new card. By comparison, if you were to upgrade just your CPU with your older 1060 or 1070, you're going to see a pretty minimal performance uplift depending on what game you're playing at, even at 1080p. So there you have a look at some older cards versus a newer one with both older and newer CPUs. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think about these cards? Are you still rocking them, or are you considering an upgrade? And would you upgrade your GPU or CPU first? Also, the graphs that you just saw are a new style for me, so I would love to hear your thoughts on those down there too, and your thoughts on this video style as well, as this is a little more of a sort of deeper dive than I would normally do. So again, let me know in those comments down below. And if you did like this style of video and want to see more like it, then unfortunately I only have a relatively limited selection of older hardware to test against and newer stuff. So if you would like to see more videos like this and want to help me out a bit, then check out the Patreon link. You can get cool rewards like access to our Money Men Discord chat, sponsor-free videos, and it means that I can actually buy some of the older and newer hardware so that I can make these videos. Also, if you want to see more videos like this one, like I said, on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday basis, then feel free to check out that subscribe button and the bell notification icon. And there's also going to be a link to the 3060 Ti I've been testing with in the description down below. That will be an Amazon affiliate link that will take you to your local Amazon store. We can see all of that good stuff. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. There are a whole load of other links in the description you can check out as well, from merch or hoodies or t-shirts like this one, or a load of other cool designs. There's other affiliate links for places like Overclockers UK if you're buying from there. There's VPN options and a load of other stuff. There will also be some more videos on the end cards you can check out, so feel free to keep watching. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.